he is, or not? I don't know.
That's what he told me yesterday.
Oh, he did? Oh, because I was going to start. Oh, here we go.
So we have a nice group we have. It's a combination of some of our faculty and some people who are in my program, the graduate program. They're teachers, they're local teachers. Just like, exactly, that's what we're doing. And hopefully they're just
To a copy of the.
okay. Yeah, hopefully we have a bunch of people online too. So when I do the welcome. Yeah, yeah, yep.
You do what you can,
We
and
do
then
what we can. Exactly, so.
I'm ready for you. Whenever you guys are ready.
Okay, thanks, Larry. Thank you. All right, I'll try to look nice for the camera. if That's possible. Yeah, thank you for bringing copies of this. Well, everybody's going to be interested in getting a copy, so. Well, hello, everyone. It's great to see you all here today, friends and members of our program, and people online too. So welcome to our virtual guests as well. So we're starting off day 2 of our conference, and we're beginning with really what should be a very exciting program. It is based on a work that Dr. Barbara Burstin has recently published. It's a way of helping students to understand what was happening in the U.S. during World War II and the Holocaust, and she's done it in graphic form, which is a real departure for Barbara, but she wanted to make it more accessible to students. So I think there are enough copies. If anyone wants a copy, you can certainly have one and think about how you can use it with your own students. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. And Barbara is joined by Amy Pallo, who is a creative and award-winning teacher from the Cornell School District in Pittsburgh. So just a little bit about our two presenters before we get started. So Dr. Burstin is a professor in the history department at the University of Pittsburgh and also Carnegie Mellon University. And she's published a number of books over the years on the Jewish experience in Pittsburgh. I have a whole bookshelf of Barbara's books up in my office. I think of her really as the kind of unofficial chronicler of Jewish Pittsburgh. She's really written a wonderful series of books. So for example, I'll just give you a few of the titles. After the Holocaust, the migration of Polish Jews and Christians to Pittsburgh. Steel City Jews, for those of you who aren't from Pittsburgh, Steel City is what we like to call ourselves. A history of the Pittsburgh Jewish community, 1840 to 1915. And then the follow-up to that book, Steel City Jews in Prosperity, Depression, and War. A history of Pittsburgh Jewish community, 1915 to 1950. So these are just a few of the titles. There are many more. Look her up online, and you'll see all of the diverse things she's published, and you'll know why I'm so excited to have her with us today. And so Barbara's teaming up with Amy Pallo. These two have taken their show on the road to a number of places in the Pittsburgh area, so I asked them to come here and share their program with us. Amy is, as I mentioned, a teacher at Cornell High School in Pittsburgh. She serves on the board of the PA Council for Social Studies, has been named a Teach Plus PA Fellow, a Gilder Lehrman PA Teacher of the Year, and a James Madison Fellow. She's also just recently received the Fulbright Distinguished Award to teach in the UK next semester. She'll be in Scotland. And Amy is a graduate of our NEH seminar that we hosted here in the summer of 2022. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Burstin and Amy Palo.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. This is such a beautiful campus, and I'm delighted to make your acquaintance. I'm also delighted that I have Amy working with me on this. She is terrific, and I guess we're might be considered a dynamic duo. I don't know. Who was that? Who was the dynamic duo? That was Batman and Robin. Right. I knew it. Anyway, so today we thought that perhaps I would go over the text and talk about the issues and so forth, and then Amy would kind of take it and go over teacher resources and talk about more how it would be tailored for high school history classes, maybe in others. I did want to say, yeah, I've been teaching this for quite some time at both Pitt and Carnegie Mellon, a course on the U.S. and the Holocaust. And I have realized over the years that this course is more than just a historical perspective about what happened in the 1930s and 40s, a perspective that students really have no idea about. They have no idea. They know something perhaps about the Holocaust, but the Holocaust to them was over there. They don't think about anything that happened in the United States. And they are really shocked to learn about some of the things that were going on in the States that, in a sense, contributed or allowed to happen what happened in Europe. So that's kind of a wake-up call. But I wanted to, first of all, in this endeavor, I decided that it would be really something valuable to try and take the content of my class and see if I could bring it to a younger cohort, junior and senior high school students, because some of the issues, many of the issues, are so relevant to today. I look upon this material as a backdrop, in a sense, to some of the concerns we have, some of the issues that we have today. So it accomplishes a great deal. It gives them a historical perspective, but it also makes them think about what a responsible citizen of the United States should be thinking about, and even at their age. So I hired an illustrator who is amazing. He himself could do a whole class for art students on how you illustrate, something I knew nothing about, but he just went with this and is passionate about the pamphlet. By the way, I don't call it a comic book because it's not funny. I call it a graphic booklet, but it looks like a comic book. So that was the title, but I don't really use that. Not only did I decide to have it as a graphic booklet, but we the illustrator actually got two students from Gateway High School, where he lives around. One is a black young man, and the other one is a white woman, white girl. And they comment, as events unfold, they comment on them. And I felt that that was another way to engage students, to have them think about the questions that these young teenagers are asking as the events unfold. So that's the plan for this, and I guess it's up to you guys to think about how you can implement it. So I want to talk about, first I want to lay out some of the issues that I feel this booklet really tries to address in a very, what should I say? I mean, it's not hitting you over the head. A teacher can certainly take it wherever that teacher wants to. How fragile democracy is. This booklet starts off with the fact that Roosevelt and Hitler come to power within 5 weeks of each other. It is a tremendous, dramatic entrance to think that you have the Democrat and the dictator. And in fact, there's a film that's available on YouTube that Bill Moyers made many years ago, but is still relevant. How he takes this scenario and builds on it. Demagoguery. What about our political leadership? What is a demagogue? How does someone like that appeal to bigotry, to anger and fear, to insecurity? This is something that students need to think about. Anti-Semitism and racism. I do mention a little bit about racism in this country at this time. These are brought up. Their history, our need to confront them. The role of America in the world. Are we a nation that cares about democracy, moral imperatives and so forth? Or are we more of an isolationist, America First kind of country? Immigration and the plight of refugees, so relevant then and now. Where you get your information. This is something that is frankly fascinating because I cover in my class, I'm not so sure you can do that in a junior high class, but the role of the press in the coverage of what was going on, and of course, how you get your information today. The press was the main vehicle back in the 30s. Today, it's social media. It brings up the whole issue of how we're getting our information. Are we getting our information? How truthful is our information? And so forth. I found that a lot of the college students didn't really understand the function of our system with checks and balances, that Congress is a player, that the president sure has much power but is not a king, and that this is something that needs to be taken accounted, checks and balances. And basically coming back to the role of citizenship responsibility. What do these young people need to think about even at their age, and especially at their age? So let me start going through the content, and I know most of you have a booklet. If anybody came late, they're well, they're not on the table, I guess, but there are some more there. And so the booklet starts with the coming to power, as I say, of Hitler and Roosevelt, and trying to think about where these leaders will take their country. And this is really something that really appeals to kids, because everybody knows Hitler, okay? Everybody knows that he did things that were not right. They don't know much about Roosevelt, frankly. So giving them the opportunity to learn a little bit about Roosevelt, I start right away that Hitler is arresting his opposition, that there's a ministry of propaganda that is spewing lies and so forth. So this is all that Jews are being scapegoated. I use that word. And that they represent only 1%, less than 1% of the population of Germany, and yet they are seen as the villain. And we get to the issue of anti-Semitism very quickly. Obviously an issue very much that has erupted today, maybe for different reasons, but nevertheless it's there. And I look at Henry Ford. Henry Ford students might know is the founder of the Ford Motor Company as an American icon, but Henry Ford was a raving anti-Semite. And I have some graphics that Amy will show you soon, but looking at Henry Ford as a way of introducing the subject of anti-Semitism into American life is something that the students absolutely have no awareness of. They think anti-Semitism is something that just erupted maybe in the last year or so, but clearly it has its roots way back. And the kids talk about it. What should we do about, and so forth. I talk about what starts happening in Germany. In May of 1933, in Germany, there is a book burning of books by Jewish authors, but also by authors who have written about peace, All Quiet on the Western Front. I don't know if any of you use that in your classes, but that was a classic anti-war book. Books by Helen Keller, blind person, any kind of books that don't represent the German culture of the master race. So I asked students about this, and these young people start to discuss it. There is a boycott of Jewish businesses that begins immediately when Hitler comes to power. What do we think about that? Is that fair? Should America respond to these events? What is our role? And why does Roosevelt not respond to these events? Okay, is it our job to be the moral compass and condemn events overseas? And I point out that Roosevelt is in a bind because Hitler could come back and say, how dare you complain about what we're doing to the Jews? Look what you're doing to the blacks in this country. We can't even get an anti-lynching bill passed in this Congress. So trying to look at the things are not so easy to make decisions. There are always other factors, and of course, the issue of racism is one that comes up immediately. Going on to page 4, I look at the Nuremberg laws. The Nuremberg laws were passed in Germany in 1935, and interestingly enough, the lawyers that promulgated, that came up with these laws, got them from America, our Jim Crow laws. All our laws against blacks in this country, they actually visited in America, spoke to jurists here, and then patterned the Nuremberg laws, which were against the Jews in Germany. Jews that laws that prohibited Jews and so-called Aryans from intermarrying, from having any kind of intercourse. It's interesting because that always raises an eyebrow, but intercourse could also mean touching, hugging. And I tell them the story of a Jewish man who had a neighbor who was dying, a Christian man who was dying, and they were good friends, and the Christian man asked this Jewish neighbor whether he would take care of his daughter. And the Jewish man did, absolutely. He paid for her education, he took care of her, and she was seen hugging him. He was arrested and ultimately beheaded for violating this Nuremberg law against intercourse, against any kind of mixing between an Aryan and a Jew. So this is horrible, but it's also reflective of what's going on in this country. So for those of you who are interested in pursuing that, this allows that kind of perspective. And then, of course, passing laws that are not moral, that are laws, legal, but legally immoral, and raising that question. And of course, that's the whole civil rights movement against passive resistance to laws that were seen as unfair and unjust. The Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, and in 1936, the Olympics are scheduled for Berlin. This was a decision that was made years before, and there is a question now that is raised by the athletes and many others. Why go to Germany when athletes are being discriminated against, when Jews can't even be on a team, can't even try out in the competition? And actually, several German Jewish athletes who were top of their field were even denied the opportunity to participate. So the question, and I spend a whole session on this, I have the students, I prepare them, I tell them this is what's coming up. They are to tell me what their sport is, so everybody loves that. And then they're going to tell me whether they're going to vote for a boycott or not, and why. And you get fascinating responses, and they can role play whatever they want. They can role play being a black athlete. They can role play being a Jewish athlete. And we get all kinds of answers. The bottom line was that the vote was taken, and we went to the Olympics. Roosevelt stayed out of it. We don't know exactly why, but he didn't pass any opinion. And of course, the notion was that sport should be left out of politics. What's very interesting is the footnote to history. Roosevelt stayed out of it, and we went. It gave Hitler, of course, a propaganda bonanza because the trains ran on time, everything was very neat and organized, and so forth. Well, a couple of things I could talk to you about. This booklet talks about John Woodruff. John Woodruff was a freshman at Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh. He was from Connellsville, and he won a gold medal in the 800-meter relay. Okay, he comes back to Pitt and cannot play on the football team because no blacks allowed. So we're dealing with these issues. In 1980, way before most of you were around, in 1980, the question was, should we go to Moscow? Because Moscow had just invaded the sovereign country of Afghanistan. Jimmy Carter said, no, we will not go. And Jimmy Carter was absolutely pilloried for that decision. So on the one hand, we went in 1936, and Roosevelt was criticized. We didn't go in 1980, and Jimmy Carter was criticized. We went to China, hoping that it would open up their human rights opportunities. That didn't happen. So the Olympics, I'm not sure, can be divorced from politics. But again, you don't have to take this as a possible topic, but it could be a fascinating discussion and lead students to go off into different directions. So I guess there are other things I can say. Interestingly enough, in 1972, the head of the American Olympic Committee, a fellow by the name of Avery Brundage. Brundage was really a German sympathizer. He loved the Germans, and he was determined to rehabilitate Germany after Hitler. So in 1972, he arranged for the Olympics to be held in Munich. Any of you know what happened in Munich in 1972? Okay, that was when the Palestinians murdered 11 Israelis. Anyway, so all kinds of history related to that and so forth, and I talk about that. At least I refer to it here on page 5. So now we're getting into, and you can talk about what happens in 1936. Hitler violates the Versailles Treaty. I don't know how much you want to talk about that. A treaty that basically was an attempt to prevent Germany from ever having the military might to go to war again. And Hitler invades the Rhineland, which was the area between France and Germany that was supposed to be demilitarized. Hitler invades that. Hitler increases his army. He starts building an air force. All of these were against the provisions of the Versailles Treaty. Nobody does anything, okay? Roosevelt's hands are tied because this country is overwhelmingly isolationist, hands off with anything going on in Europe. We've passed neutrality laws that prevent us to even carry munitions to a country that is attacked. We make no difference. We're not carrying munitions to Europe, period, whether the country has been attacked or not. Anyway, Hitler starts in March of 1938. Hitler starts annexing Austria. This is called the Anschluss, and this starts the whole progression of his aggression. And the issue about the Jews now of Austria are now suddenly threatened, terrorized on the streets. There are stories about this. Women forced to, all kinds of terror on the streets. And here, the students start talking about, well, why don't we do something? Maybe we can help. There were 500,000 Jews in Germany, representing 1% of the population, less than 1% out of 60 million people. And now there are another 200,000 Jews of Austria. What's supposed to happen with them? And they're saying, why don't we do something? And then we start talking about, well, there are laws in this country that have been passed to keep refugees, to keep immigrants out. And then, the young man says, I don't get it. I know all about discrimination against black people, but I didn't know there was discrimination against some other peoples as well. And on the next page, I talk about the 1924 act known as the Johnson-Reed Act. This Johnson-Reed Act was passed tremendously cutting the numbers of people who could come into this country to about 153,000 from 1,800,000, 1 million who were coming in each year. And I asked students to think about, when did your immigrant ancestors come? And it's very interesting, especially in this area where many of the immigrant ancestors of the students are Eastern Europeans who came between 1880 and 1920. The act went into effect in 1924. Not only did it limit future immigrants, but it indicated who those immigrants should be. Okay, this is a very, very important act in our history because it said half of those people had to come from Great Britain because they were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and they limited the rest of Europe, especially Eastern Europe. So from Eastern regions in Europe, only a few thousand could come in any one year. There were quotas, okay? The act was called the Johnson-Reed Act. David Reed was the senator from Pittsburgh, okay? So, and his descendants were Reed Smith, Shaw McClay, a very prominent law firm. So again, Pittsburgh connection, but the act was passed. It had nothing to do with Hitler. It had to do with the Eastern Europeans who were coming into this country at the turn of the 20th century, who were primarily Catholic from Italy, from Poland, and Eastern Orthodox, with a tiny minority of them being Jewish. That's why the act was passed. It had nothing to do. So it's on the books, though. Students need to realize it's on the books when Hitler comes to power. And Roosevelt is kind of tied. He clearly, and this is another fascinating thing, does Roosevelt care about the Jews? Well, there is no question that he has indicated his interest, his concern, because Roosevelt in July of 1938 calls what's known as the Evian conference in Evian, France. And it's an effort, he calls together about 32 democratic nations to deal with the refugee issue. He gets no political points for this because Jews are already voting for Roosevelt. They like him. They think he's great because he's a man for the underdog and he's not an anti-Semite. He's been appointing Jews to his cabinet. He appointed Felix Frankfurter to the Supreme Court as a Jew. Roosevelt is on their side. He calls this conference in Evian, France, in order to have the free world respond to the plight of these desperate refugees who were trying to get out from Hitler's noose, and nothing really happens. And so Hitler can say after that, well, you know, look, you had the opportunity to take these Jews, you didn't care about them, so stop picking on me. And it raises the question, what is our connection then to giving Hitler that sense that he could get away with anything? Okay? Linking America to the Holocaust in a very, what should I say, very gentle way, but nevertheless on that ladder of responsibility for the events that ultimately are known as the Holocaust. Was there a rung on that ladder for America? The Evian conference, by the way, you know how to spell Evian because it's the water. Spell it backwards. Yell out to me what it is backwards. Naive, okay? Journalists, other people said we were naive to think that anybody would care. Okay, so this is stuff for kids to talk about in multiple ways, and I have the kids doing that, and I'm talking, and I'm also mentioning about the rise of anti-Semitism in this country. There were more than 120 groups that are formed that are spreading propaganda that is actually produced by Hitler's Ministry of Propaganda in Germany and is shipped here and distributed around the country. All legal. And so you have this escalation. You'll see, because I have, Paula will show you, because Amy will show you, because I use certain documents to illustrate this, public opinion polls that show the rise of anti-Semitism. Anyway, you have in November 9th, 10th, the night of November 9th, 10th, in fact, celebrations are right now. In 1938, at this very time, there was an event called Kristallnacht, where Jewish businesses were destroyed. Every synagogue in Austria and Germany was destroyed. I asked kids, how do you think it made people feel when their place of worship was destroyed? Now, I don't know about you, but the college students, not too many of them are that religious that they have been going to church or synagogue. So it doesn't necessarily grab them, but I try and do role-playing with them, okay? So this was, people are carted off to concentration camps without any reason, just because they're Jews. So we're up to page 8, and the kids ask, why are they being imprisoned? What did they do? Well, they're Jewish, that's the reason. So, and then I talk about that. I talk about in 1939, Senator Robert Wagner and Congresswoman Edith Rogers present a bill called the Wagner-Rogers Bill to bring 20,000 German, presumably Jewish kids to America. And then I contrast that with a bill that was presented in the summer of 1940 called the Hennings Bill that was in the midst of the British attack by Hitler on Britain to bring British kids to America. The Wagner-Rogers Bill that involved German Jews, Jewish children, didn't even make it out of committee. The Hennings Bill that involved British Protestant children passed in flying colors. The kids never came because we could not guarantee them safe shipping across the Atlantic, so they never came. But just that difference in congressional action, what does that tell you about Congress? Okay, so this is something, again, to look into. So we get to the St. Louis, the ship the St. Louis. Not over 900 Jewish refugees, desperate, have had to get rid of, they have basically $10 in their pocket. That's all that Hitler allows them to leave with. They are planning to go to Cuba, to stay in Cuba until their number comes up. Remember, there's a quota system, so they have to wait until their number can come up. So Cuba was the destination, but en route to Cuba, the president of Cuba says, you know, I've got enough Jews, I'm under enough pressure, I'm not letting these passengers disembark. So the ship is forced to leave Cuba, and the ship's captain is an anti-Nazi and is determined to try to save these people because he knows if they go back to Europe, they're done. So he sails and in the harbor of Miami, Florida, and he waits, and telegrams go back and forth. Please let these people get off. Nobody is allowed to get off, okay? The ship has to go back, but they make arrangements that a good chunk of these people wind up in Britain, where they are safe, but the rest of them wind up in France or Belgium or Holland, where they have to, when Hitler now overruns and they're now sitting ducks. It's a fascinating time. It's a fascinating story because it seems to indicate Roosevelt's lack of interest in the Jews, America's failure to respond. So we talk about that, but I point out something else. I point out that Roosevelt is very concerned about the rise of Hitler, his aggression, and what's happening. And Roosevelt knows that this country might need to go to war. And we are totally unprepared. We're ranked like 17th in the world in terms of our army. And so he needs Congress to support not just his New Deal, his domestic program, but also new expenditures for preparation for war in case. If he accepts the refugees, Congress will be so angered, because they don't care about refugees, that they might not go along with his expenditures for improving our army, our defense industry, and so forth. So he doesn't act, okay? Does this make him a bad guy, or it just makes it a very complicated situation? Okay, again, it's a fascinating discussion kids can have. I do kind of refer to that he has to wait for Congress. This is not a system where the president can just say, this is what I'm going to do. He needs congressional support, okay? And that clearly is an issue today and so forth. Okay, and I talk about that getting on to, because I want to watch time here. Wow, okay, I'm going to go kind of quickly. If Roosevelt takes it, and then I talk about what Roosevelt has done to show that he cares about Jews, but he's kind of hamstrung. And now we get into, well, you know, frankly, once we get into the war, this is something that, you know, to me, the 1930s is fascinating. Once you start getting into the war, there are war issues, obviously. And the question in terms of the Holocaust is, what could we have done? And up to 1943, there's virtually nothing we could have done to save the Jews in Europe. 1942 is known as the killing year. 2.7 million Jews are alleged to have been killed in 1942. and we are nowhere. We have engaged the Germans finally, but in North Africa, not, D-Day with the invasion of France doesn't come till June 6, 1944. So we could deal with, the outbreak of the war and so forth, but when it comes to the Jews, there's really not a whole that we can do until 1943. But then the question is, what do we do? Keep in mind that the Japanese, we don't get into the war until December 7th, 1941. And we never declare war on Germany. They declare war on us 4 days later because Hitler thinks that America is run by a bunch of blacks and Jews, that they're weak and America can never be a strong nation. And so he decides to just kind of get rid of us, declare war on us now, and not have to worry about us. And of course, we are not weak. But in 1943, what happens? Well, in 1943, you have a conference in Bermuda that the British and American State Department arrange, and now we start seeing that the American State Department is no friend of the Jews, has done everything they can to not respond to any issues. They call a conference in Bermuda, an island that you can't even get to, so they control access. No prying press people are there. No American Jewish organizations are allowed to come. It's a mockery, and I have the headline that my illustrator did from the New York Times. This was not their story because the New York Times never really covered the story of the Holocaust. That's one of the big issues. This was a paid ad that was taken out, calling the Bermuda Conference a cruel mockery, that it was it was an effort not to help the Jews, but to help the State Department and the British Foreign Office look good. Continuing, I want to do this fairly quickly now. Continuing, finally, by the end of 1943, young lawyers in the Treasury Department, Protestant young lawyers, discover that the State Department has been suppressing information, not responding to possible rescue attempts, and they are enraged, and they go to their boss, who is Henry Morgenthau, who is a Jew, but who has not really pressed the Jewish cause because he is fearful of being called, only caring about Jews and not Americans. He's Roosevelt's friend and neighbor, but he is so enraged by what the Treasury Department has discovered about the State Department that he goes to Morgenthau. Morgenthau goes to Roosevelt, and we get set up something known as the War Refugee Board. The War Refugee Board is our first and the world's only effort to create an agency that is devoted to saving Jews with the same intensity as Hitler is determined to kill the Jews. So this is something that really we need to recognize, that it is a humanitarian effort. It is a desperate effort. It's late in the game. It's 1944. But they wind up saving tens of thousands of Jews. Some say up to 200,000. So I deal with that. We're on page 20, kind of like that. I mean, there's other things, but I'm rushing because I want to get to Amy. And I end with really the kids saying, well, what can we do? We don't want to be a bystander. We don't want to be somebody who just watches this. We need to take some ownership in what America does. And I think it's a wonderful message for students to think about their need to confront bigotry, their need to be more informed about what's going on in this world, to be a responsible citizen, which I think all of us in this room and everybody listening cares about. Okay, so I'm saying that this whole content can be taken multiple ways, and that it's really, you know, you can pick pieces out of this. I also want to mention that any teacher, and I just found out about this, any teacher who wants to take bulk copies for their classroom, there is a foundation that you can apply to cover the cost if your school is not able to afford that. And so you have my email someplace, I think it's, if you want to, I'm happy to be available and to talk, maybe even to come into a school for a workshop. But anyway, so let me turn this over to Amy and allow you to get another perspective.
Hi. Hello. I've been doing this with Barbara for a little while now, and I've given a bunch of different talks. This is, by the way, not our normal format. We're a little more back and forth. This is a little formal at the microphone here today, so bear with us. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the resources, but here I'm going to talk to you today about being a high school teacher, an American history teacher. I do teach other things as well, but how this fits in for me and why this particular resource was very helpful and important. So I'm hoping that the educators in the room can take something away from that, besides the amazing content that goes into this. So first of all, behind me, you have 2 QR codes. Classrooms Without Borders, which is a local organization, did make a teacher guide to go along with this. And then I also have a Google Drive, which is the top QR code. This is also going to be online, as well as Barbara's email is online. So if you missed this right now, no big deal. And if you didn't know, if you just take a picture of this, you can then go in your photos and click on the QR code and click it from there. Just found out that recently, and that is, I know sometimes we're real annoyed by QR codes if it's not catching. If I asked my students in any given year if they would accept and bring in all of those passengers from the St. Louis, overwhelmingly, no question about it, let them in, save those passengers, okay? Without context, overwhelmingly, bring them here. And we have hindsight. We know what happened to those passengers, and we would all like to think of ourselves as somebody who would save those passengers, right? And I can promise you that the overwhelming amount of people who do that do not always have that same worldview when they look at the world today. So when Barbara talks about, you know, ending with that idea of what can you do or what can somebody in such a small position do, that kind of mindset and thinking about those things is important. So it's my job as an educator to help them think critically about these things, to provide some context, some critical thinking, right? So when I'm teaching this particular subject in an American history class, in a typical American history class in a lot of high schools, probably 11th grade, right, probably starts Reconstruction to the present, and if you get past Vietnam, you did a good job, right? That's what we're looking at in most school districts and most state standards, right? And so you're going to situate this, right, this topic particularly in your World War II unit, okay? So it's going to be a part, but not the focus of most American history teachers' World War II units. Now, if you teach in a wonderful school district like mine with an administrative staff that's supportive of me teaching this, and a phenomenal English department that is doing a great job when they're teaching night in 10th grade and doing a great job in 8th grade with the Diary of Anne Frank, your students come to you with some knowledge. But that's a blessing and a curse. right? I don't want to be repetitive. I don't want to be reductive. And what am I going to do then in that American history class to make it make sense, right? So I have to think pedagogically what's appropriate. I also have to think about time. Some of you might be looking at 1, 2, 3 days to cover this topic in an American history class. And some of you might be blessed to have a full semester study on genocide and Holocaust and have more time. So everybody's coming at this in kind of a different situation. I'm well positioned with prior knowledge in my district because, again, I have a phenomenal ELA colleagues, right, who are bringing this to the students before they get to me. At the same time, I don't have all the time in the world. Okay? So the first time that I met Barbara and heard her speak, the first thing that really helped and clicked for me was framing this with the Democrat and the dictator, right? The idea that these two people came into power in such close proximity. Because we have the tendency sometimes, and maybe, I won't speak for everyone, so maybe it's me, I have the tendency sometimes to fall into grouping things into things. We like as human beings, right, to categorize, right? So you get these themes. And it's very important, though, you can't wake up in 1942. You can't wake up after the Wannsee Conference and say, this is happening now, right? It didn't happen in the 1940s. This happened, I mean, from the late 19th century, right? But there are things that are happening one after another to lead us to this, right? For the same reason, once I get out of my World War II unit, that can't be the first time I ever mention civil rights, right? It can't be this magic thing that is now a problem, right? You have to pull these threads along as you go. And so what is super helpful for me about this resource is it tells a narrative, but it brings in a lot of those things that are happening in the 1930s that are very important to provide that context to get your students to think more critically about these things. Okay? So that's one of the things that I'm looking at when I'm doing this. And again, all of those students really think that they would be 100% on board, and I love it for them. I love their optimism there. 100%, let those people in, right? Bring the St. Louis here, right? And that's fantastic. And then we start discussing that. We discuss FDR's position, right? And what he needs to accomplish. And those discussions make them uncomfortable because we don't like when there's not a perfect answer, right? And sometimes we have to sit with multiple things being true, and sometimes we have to sit with very difficult things being true, and they don't love it when I don't have an answer for them, right? That's something that kids really dislike, when they can't go to the internet, when they can't go to their teacher, when they can't go to a trusted adult and say, this is black and white what's right, because rarely is there ever a black and white what's right from everybody's perspective, right? So it's a complicated issue, and something's probably going to get sacrificed most of the time, and that's terrible to have to understand, right? So I'm starting from that place, right? I'm starting from a place of trying to figure out, where to fit this in. This particular piece of media can be accomplished in a classroom in anywhere from 1 to 3 days with students reading the entire thing. So that's the beauty of it, because you as a teacher then, you know how much time you have, right? The other beauty of this is that it is definitely appropriate for both middle and high school, right? Because how far into the supplementary resources you want to go is going to be completely up to you and what's appropriate for your students and what's appropriate for your classroom. So for instance, one of the things that's super beneficial for me about this is that it follows along with a lot of the already existing resources from the United States Memorial Holocaust Museum. So for instance, I can go here, they can mention the St. Louis, we can talk about here, but they can go here for way more in-depth information if I have the time to do that, right? But another thing that I'm thinking about again is I'm framing this from an American history perspective. So you have to start thinking about, when those students are having those moral questions and thinking about this critically, you have to think about why maybe the U.S. St. Louis, or not the U.S., the SS St. Louis, maybe why wasn't that on the forefront of these people's minds? So there's two Langston Hughes poems that I like to use when I am doing this unit, that I like to use when I'm talking about the 1930s in general. And one is called The Ballad of the Landlord, and that is about racism and housing. But the other is called Waiting on Roosevelt. And Waiting on Roosevelt essentially goes through the story of a fellow who is just starving and can't afford a doctor for their child, and continues on all these things. And there's this optimism at the start of it. They're waiting on Roosevelt, and by the end, there's this frustration that they're waiting on Roosevelt. So it helps highlight the issues that Americans are going through and what is in their mind. Their mind is feeding their family. Their mind is, how are they impacted by the Great Depression? And again, there are multiple perspectives from multiple different people's stations in America on how that's impacting them, right? And so this particular booklet really helps me as a jumping off point for all of those discussions, okay? So in this QR code that I gave you, you are going to find a drive, and in that drive there is going to be a folder with some resources on anti-Semitism in the United States during this time. So there are some resources like ones that Barbara already mentioned, including some remakes of the Dearborn Independent to bring in anti-Semitism and Henry Ford. And you have to understand the impact that Henry Ford is having on working families in America, but also how ubiquitous this is going to be throughout car dealerships, right? So this is, and how that could be distributed. So you'll find resources like this. And these are a mix of resources. Some of them are ones that I've created to go along with my class. Some of them are ones that Barbara has found in the Hillman archives mostly, right, at the University of Pittsburgh. And then she had also mentioned so then there is some information on what's happening in Germany, including the Nuremberg laws and the German Bund. There are some resources just on the Holocaust in general, but she'd mentioned the Democrat and the Dictator, and so there is there's a movie file in here for that, and a watching guide and a viewing guide. If you are a high school educator, I can promise you're not going to show this whole thing because you know the attention span of your teenagers in your class. But parts of it are super helpful, and the viewing guide that goes along with it is also super helpful. And I think it's a very valuable resource to use in part with high school students. But if you're somebody who has not seen this and is an educator of this, this is a pretty interesting thing for you to watch. So this is in there as well. And then some additional resources, including an activity that I had my students do. So I had my students do a continuation of the comic style. So what we did was students chose, basically we worked together to generate a list of what they felt were important topics that they really didn't know about prior to reading the booklet. A lot of them picked things like the Wannsee Conference or the Evian Conference or things like that. And then the students just engaged in some research on that. I gave them some high quality resources, mostly things like from the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And then they created, they could use a couple of pages. I have a bunch, they didn't have to use all of them, or they could repeat, or they could do it on their own and draw on their own, but you know, some students like that, some students don't. And we did this as an extension activity afterwards. So students continued this style in telling a more in-depth story on one of the particular topics in here. And so again, in your classes, you might divide that up equally. You might have them present that, however it works out for you and the time that you have, right? The other thing that I particularly love about this, and I don't want to make this seem like something that's only appropriate for local teachers. But the thing that I like as a local teacher is that the Pittsburgh story is in here, right? Kids know Jesse Owens. Kids know the story of Jesse Owens, but they don't really know the University of Pitt's kind of experience with that, right? And so they don't know the name John Woodruff. I mean, some of them might, but a lot of them don't, right? There's a mention in here of the Double V campaign, which I do assume people would be covering in their World War II units, but it's in here too, right? So it's showing that connection. And when you start to look online, there is a link in here. I don't have it pulled up right now, but there's a link in here to the newspapers from the Holocaust Memorials site that talks about, that lets you search newspapers essentially by what they knew, right? Who knew what, where. Because there wasn't zero information here, but largely, local newspapers, Jewish newspapers, Black-run newspapers, these are the ones who are more likely to be reporting and reporting widely on some of this, and they can see that. But the fact that the Pittsburgh story's in here, and then just the kids pulling you along, right? Sometimes it can be hard. You have to remember this, that no matter how many times the kids come to you having learned this information, or how desensitized you think kids are today, this is tough, right? And there are things that and this is not this challenges you in a lot of ways, but this is not a particularly graphic, right? But as you start sending them out to find more information, or as they start looking even at plain black and white numbers, it's horrific, right? It's terrible, and sometimes kids put up a pretty good front, but you have to understand that that's sometimes a front, right? This can be very difficult. So beyond creating a space in your classrooms where you're acknowledging that and making that kind of at the forefront, the fact that these two kids are telling the story and going back and forth lets the kids relate to it, but also lets them let them tell the story and let them ask the questions. And it kind of gives them the chance to access it if they are having a little bit of trouble in that realm, right? Does that make sense? So those are all things that that really made this something that made sense for me to use in my classroom. And again, the time is the thing. In the American history class, you have a couple of things to think about. How are you going to do this in time? How are you not going to just make this a side product of World War II, right? How are you bringing it to the forefront? How are you bringing it to kids in ways that are engaging, which I think the graphics certainly does, and then the use of the kids. And my kids particularly like hearing that they're local kids from Gateway who are just a little bit older than them and actually got to be part of that. But all of those things are considerations that you kind of have when you're doing it, and this particular resource has been really helpful in helping me achieve all of those. We wanted to leave a little bit of time, first of all, for Barbara to say any other thoughts, but also if anybody had any questions for either of us about how you might want, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say we have the microphone set up there, so when you're ready, we can take some questions.
We're ready.
We're ready. So again, and as you're thinking, and if you would like to head to the microphone and just let us know, but you can access all of these things in this drive from here. Barbara's email is on there, but this is also going to be on the website here. We gave them the information this morning, so if you forgot, you lose it, it's fine. We are accessible. So.
I want to make sure everybody has a copy of the booklet. We have some more, I think, but if you want to come forward afterwards, I'll see how many I have here. If not, I'll run out and get you some more. So I want anybody who wants a copy to have it. I'll have to go to my car, okay.
Amy, in your extension activity with the graphic, How much time does it take for your students to do that? And how do you handle it when students don't have much artistic skill?
Okay, so that's a great question. She wants to know with my graphic extension, how much time and how do I handle it when students don't have artistic skill? First of all, I don't believe any student doesn't have artistic skill. They like to tell you that. They love to, I'm not a drawer. So there's that, so there's that part of it. This is the beauty of it. Time can be flexible. So I wanted this to be, I had a little bit more time in my classroom, and I wanted this to be a little bit longer of a project. So I had students have about 2 days for the research and the bio sheet, and I had them do like a written reflection too. And then I had the students also have about 2 days to do their drawing, and I had them do a certain amount of panels, and that could vary. And then I had them also then present to each other, and students also just love when you make them get up in front of each other. I have a great trick for that. If they don't, if they're, if you caught my little bit of sarcasm there. If you have some reluctant sharers, something that I like to do that I learned at some professional development and have just run with for years, is I line them up in 2 lines and have them present one-on-one and then just keep rotating. They don't hit every single person. You get a time limit, right? One presents and then the other presents. So whether it's 2 minutes, 3 minutes each, whatever, 1 minute each if you're in a hurry and I don't have big classes. I'm super lucky. So, however you want to do it, and then have them rotate, and you just kind of walk and monitor. So if that's something that interests you, that's something that I have found has been very successful in my classes. But if you wanted to have them do a very quick, if you already created a document where you put the links to the USHMM topic, right, which they have all of these topics there, and they have beautiful pages, and they redid it a few years ago to be like that with the 3 key ideas, and then it goes more in depth. If you had the links already ready for you, for them, and just had just the quick bio sheet and just 1 page of panels, you could have them do it in 1 to 2 days, or have them do it for a homework assignment or something like that. So you can extend it, or you can make it smaller. And one of the things that I would kind of like to do is, and I haven't done this yet, so this is not tested, but I have the idea of doing this in my U.S. history class in each unit, where the students kind of pick their point of view. I'd like it to kind of be like their point of view if they were there, so whoever they are as a person, like in this time period, and kind of do one in each unit, right, to kind of reflect on each unit as we go on, so kind of like throughout the time period that we're doing. I haven't fully fleshed that out, so come back in a year or two. What, 3 years for this? Come back in 3 years and I'll let you know if it worked out. Or send me an email. Yeah, so again, just like I said with the information in here, if you are really pressed on time, you can only have 2 days for this topic, and you could get through this, right? You could also spend easily 2-3 weeks getting through this. So it really is flexible, and that's why I find this a very useful resource for me, if that helps. If it's a non-answer, I'm sorry, Ann.
Other questions, or? Yes, sir.
Hi, ladies. I'm Brian Dormeyer from Shaler Area Middle School. I teach 7th grade English. How do you navigate any parallels that are brought by students from this book to modern American politics? It's a very delicate conversation, but anybody who reads this would be able to find them. Do you ever get into trouble teaching it, or is it something that you're able to deflect and handle?
There's a ring, I'm not sure I heard.
Okay, so his question is, when students are, no, you're okay. When students are reading this, how do you navigate modern parallels, and I think navigate that tightrope in your class to not be on the news? which is, something that I think most educators have to think about. So, a few years ago in Pennsylvania, and I think they could have gone farther with this, right? But, our legislature asks, are you teaching genocide, Holocaust, and human rights studies in your classes, right? And schools had to self-report, so there's the issues that come with that. And if they didn't, they were going to mandate this, and they didn't end up mandating it because the self-reporting came back that schools in Pennsylvania are teaching this at a certain threshold. And so I think you kind of can fall back on that. This is something that our state legislature wants us to have in our curriculum. That is a very tricky question because everybody teaches in very different places, right? If you're teaching at the university level, that's different than if you're teaching at the high school level. And you want to?
Yeah, it's true that, at the university level it's a little different, but I don't ever use names, okay? So, let the students think for themselves. You're dealing with the historical material. And, so if they happen to, what I've said in class is that, these are contemporary issues, okay? How do we respond to immigrants? Okay, so you can raise the issues without naming who, getting into the politics per se. And I've been very careful about that, and because you need to be. Your job is not to tell them who they should vote for, but just dealing with the issues and having them think about, how they feel about it today, that's okay. I don't see why that wouldn't be okay.
My advice, and full disclosure, I am teaching in a place that's incredibly supportive of me in the classroom. My superintendent is a former social studies teacher who taught in my room, so would not be a question for him, and I understand that people aren't in that situation. But I'm also coming from a place of like my union president. I'm the union president, and my advice for anybody, for any time that you're teaching a part of history, that despite being a part of history is still going to be seen as contentious. First of all, that line always changes. What is contentious today wasn't necessarily contentious 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, won't necessarily be contentious 5 years from now. So you constantly have to be aware of that. But my biggest advice for that is to ground it in standards, ground it in some primary source material, and be able to discuss why you brought something to the students, how it fits into your scope and sequence, and just be prepared to have that discussion. Very few people locally, because this I can't speak really outside of Western PA, or pretty much Pennsylvania in general. Very few people kind of locally have that issue, but it's not non-existent, right? And there are a few districts that have pushed back on the teaching of this material, and that's certainly difficult. I don't have the best answer because we are not always the people in the biggest position of power, and so again, my advice is always just ground it in both primary sources and have those standards ready and be ready to present that if you are called into your administrator and with a board member or whatever.
You're presenting issues that were raised in the 30s and 40s, so, you can go back to that. Look, this is history. Okay, so.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And we may have more. I'm sorry. I'll just come
you
over
can.
to the microphone for a second. Yes, thank you both so much. First of all, let's give a round of applause to our presenters. You both did a wonderful job. I appreciate it. And by the way, everything we discussed here and that we will discuss throughout the conference will be reported in a book that we will publish. We always publish our conference proceedings. It'll take a few months before that comes out, But in the meantime, so you'll be able to read more about all the things you've heard this morning and that you will hear at the conference in the book. Everybody who signed up for the conference is eligible to receive a copy of the book. But in the meantime, if you do have questions, I'm sure Amy and Barbara will be happy to answer them. And the little bit of disruption we had over there during the presentation is because our wonderful food service was bringing in lunch. So please stay. We only have about 25 minutes until the next session begins at 12:40. Our presenters are already here and ready to go. But in the meantime, let's get some lunch and have a chance to talk with each other a little bit. So see you in a few minutes.
certain position on